It started like any ordinary day. Nothing unusual, nothing special. But behind the routine was a storm waiting to break. Harold had no idea that everything he knew was about to fall apart. Not just a setback, a complete collapse. Rock bottom wasn't a theory. It was real. And it came fast. People turned their backs. Doors closed. Time ran out. But this story isn't about the fall. It's about what happened next. The moment he decided to fight back, to build from ashes, to outwork, outlearn, and outlast. What no one saw coming was a comeback so big, it changed everything. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And hit subscribe, because stories like this, they might just change the way you see your own. The man behind the screen. At 72, Harold Miller stood out in Silicon Valley like a relic from another time. When tech executives gathered in gleaming conference rooms, Harold tinkered away in a cramped living room in rural Pennsylvania. No venture capital, no Stanford degree, no connections, just calloused hands that had spent decades building bridges, not apps, and a mind that refused to accept limitations. Harold had retired 5 years earlier from his engineering job at the county. A modest pension, a small house paid off, and plans to spend quiet days fishing with his wife, Margaret. But life rarely follows the script we write for it. First, Margaret's cancer diagnosis came with brutal swiftness. 18 months later, Harold sat alone in the house they'd shared for 43 years. Then came the call about his son, James. A highway accident. No survivors. In the aftermath, Harold found himself the guardian of his 8-year-old granddaughter, Emily. A child who saw the world differently, her autism creating both brilliant perceptions and painful barriers. She has so much to say, Harold told his neighbor one evening. But the words, they get trapped inside her. The struggle begins. The first months were a blur of grief and adjustment. Harold, a man who had built structures to withstand hurricanes, found himself overwhelmed by school forms and therapy appointments. Emily barely spoke. When frustrated, she would retreat into silence for days. Her school assigned a speech therapist who suggested visual communication aids. The professional systems cost thousands, money Harold simply didn't have after Margaret's medical bills. "I'll figure something out," he told the therapist. That night, as Emily finally slept, Harold opened his old laptop. The screen illuminated his weathered face as he typed, how to make a simple app. He had never written a line of code, had never developed software. His engineering had been concrete and steel, not bytes and algorithms. The learning curve wasn't steep, it was vertical. Harold stayed up until 3 a.m., bleary-eyed but determined, watching YouTube tutorials meant for people a third his age. He took notes in the same meticulous engineering notebook he'd used for decades. Days became weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Emily's therapist recommended symbols and picture sequences that might help her communicate. Harold transformed them into digital flashcards, adding sounds, transitions, simple animations. "It's not much," he apologized when showing her the first prototype. But Emily's eyes widened at the screen. Her finger touched an image of a glass. "Water," she said clearly. The first word she'd spoken in weeks. Harold's hands trembled as he added more symbols that night. Breaking point. 6 months in, progress stalled. The app worked on Harold's computer, but needed proper development to function on tablets and phones. The hosting costs for even a basic version exceeded what he could afford. The winter was brutal. Harold cut back on heating to save money. He skipped meals. His ancient truck needed repairs he couldn't pay for. One night, after Emily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by coding books borrowed from the library, and put his head in his hands. "I can't do this, Margaret," he whispered to the empty chair across from him. "I'm too old, too slow." The next morning, he placed a "for sale" sign on his truck. A week later, it was gone. replaced by enough money to pay for professional app development assistance and 6 months of hosting costs. Harold had no transportation now except an old bicycle, but he had bought himself time. When the local newspaper ran a small story about the elderly engineer building an app for his granddaughter, Harold was embarrassed by the attention. But that article found its way to a recent computer science graduate who offered to help clean up the code for free. "My brother has autism," the young developer explained. "I get it." The unexpected turn. 13 months after his first Google search about app development, Harold received an email. "My son has been nonverbal since birth," it read. "Yesterday, he used your app to tell me he was hungry. I heard his voice for the first time in 6 years. How can I thank you?" Harold stared at the screen. Someone outside of Emily had downloaded his creation. Someone he'd never met. He checked the analytics. 27 downloads, then 50, then 100. A special education teacher in Cleveland had discovered the app and shared it with colleagues. Parents began writing reviews, suggesting improvements. Harold worked through nights, implementing their ideas, responding to emails during his lunch break at the part-time job he'd taken at the hardware store to keep the project afloat. Emily was speaking more now. Short sentences, questions, even jokes sometimes. When the local school district inquired about licensing the app for all their special needs students, Harold didn't know how to price it. He asked for enough to cover his costs and a little extra to improve the features. "This is worth 10 times what you're asking," the district technology coordinator told him. "Do you have any idea what you've built?" Harold didn't. He was just solving a problem for Emily. The Breaking Wave. The Barrett Foundation for Children with Disabilities discovered the app through a parent's testimonial video that went viral. Their program director flew to Pennsylvania to meet Harold. "We'd like to fund further development," she explained over coffee in Harold's modest kitchen. "This could help thousands of children." Harold's hands shook slightly as he signed the contract. The foundation would provide development resources, marketing, and distribution. His creation would reach families who needed it most. Emily, now 10, sat beside him at the table, using the app to express her thoughts about the partnership. "Grandpa made it for me," she said clearly, "but now it's for everybody." The foundation connection led to academic interest. Research studies began documenting the app's effectiveness. Speech therapists incorporated it into their practices. Harold, now 74, still rode his bicycle to the hardware store 3 days a week. He still lived in the same small house, but his nights were filled with video conferences with developers across the country, refining and expanding what had begun as a desperate attempt to reach his granddaughter. The Google meeting. The email from Google's accessibility team seemed like spam at first. Harold nearly deleted it. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday. Harold wore his only suit, purchased 20 years earlier for Margaret's cousin's wedding. It hung loose on his frame now. He sat nervously in the conference room as executives discussed terms, acquisition structures, integration plans, words that meant little to him. "Mr. Miller," the lead negotiator finally said, "we believe your application fills a critical need in our accessibility portfolio. As part of our commitment to tools for users with disabilities, we'd like to acquire your technology." Harold looked down at his calloused hands. "Will it still be available to everyone, even those who can't afford it?" "That's precisely why we're interested," came the reply. "As part of our social impact initiative, we intend to make it freely available worldwide, with your continued input on development." The number they offered wasn't in the millions. Harold wouldn't be featured in Forbes, but it was enough to secure Emily's future, to create a trust for her care long after he would be gone. More importantly, the technology he had built at his kitchen table would reach millions of children globally. Aftermath. When the acquisition was announced, tech blogs expressed surprise. Who was this septuagenarian developer Google had acquired? Where was his team, his previous ventures? Harold declined most interview requests. He did agree to one, with the local newspaper that had first covered his story. "I'm not a tech entrepreneur," he told the reporter. "I'm just a grandfather, who needed to hear his granddaughter's voice. Harold finally replaced his truck. He established Emily's trust fund. He even hired a part-time caregiver to help with her needs. But most mornings, you could still find him at the same kitchen table, working with Google's development team, reading emails from parents around the world whose children were finding their voices through technology born of love and desperation. Emily, now attending mainstream classes with support, once asked why he hadn't bought a bigger house with the Google money. Harold glanced around at the walls filled with Margaret's paintings, at the worn furniture that held the imprints of their life together. "Some wealth isn't measured in dollars," he told her. 6 months after the acquisition, Google's CEO invited Harold to the company's annual developer conference. As he walked onto the stage, 3,000 people rose in standing ovation, not for a tech wizard, but for a man who had refused to accept limitations, who had learned to code at 72 because love demanded it. In the front row sat Emily, now confident enough to attend such a large event. When it was her turn at the microphone during the Q&A, she didn't need the app anymore. Her voice rang clear through the auditorium. "My grandfather taught me that it's never too late to build something that matters." As the applause washed over them, Harold understood something profound. Success had never been about the money or the acquisition. It had been about connection, about bridging the gaps between hearts, between minds, between what is and what could be. He hadn't set out to disrupt an industry or create the next unicorn startup. He had simply refused to accept a world where his granddaughter remained locked in silence. And in breaking down that wall, he had opened doors for thousands more. Hit subscribe if this story resonated with you. And tell me below, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? Was it worth it? Until next time, remember, every empire begins with a single, terrifying decision.